Hello. This is Lecture 2 in the Advanced Level Linguistic Anthropology course. We have titled this lecture, Who Needs Symbolic Thinking? In the previous introductory lecture, we provided a preliminary overview of the main themes that will be explored throughout this course. Some of these themes may appear unconventional or atypical in discussions about the nature and origins of language. Let us list them. 1. The primary function of language is to restore the adequacy of human perception. 2. The exchange of mental images in linguistic form reinforces the illusion of a bounded self in humans. 3. My linguistic self is perceived as existing outside my biological body. The external reality, as expressed through language, constitutes the I. To establish a foundation for further exploration of these topics, today's session will examine mainstream perspectives on the nature of language and its evolutionary origins. It is important to note that serious scientists approach the question of language origins with extreme caution. This caution dates back to 1866, when the Linguistic Society of Paris imposed a ban on accepting scientific papers that speculated on the origins of language. The rationale behind this decision was that speculative theories in these studies far outpaced empirical evidence. For much of modern history, it has been considered risky to a scientist's reputation to provide a direct answer to the question, how did language emerge? However, despite this academic reluctance, it remains difficult to meaningfully study language without at least proposing tentative hypotheses about its origins. Linguist Ray Jackendorf states, "Your theory of language evolution depends on your theory of language." However, we would argue that the reverse is more accurate, even if the origins of language can only be reconstructed theoretically. To facilitate our discussion, we will now examine a diagram that broadly categorizes contemporary scientific perspectives on the origins and nature of language. Let us begin by examining the upper level of the diagram, focusing first on the left-hand box. A traditional evolutionary perspective suggests that language developed in proto-humans as a gradual enhancement of animal communication systems, ACS, in response to new environmental challenges. According to this view, the changing environment shaped the anatomy, brain structure, and behavior of early hominins, ultimately leading to the emergence of the faculty of speech, a skill that provided Homo sapiens with an unprecedented competitive advantage. One of the most frequently cited theories within this framework is the savanna hypothesis. This theory posits that A. As the climate cooled, savannas replaced tropical forests. B. These open environments presented new challenges, necessitating complex cooperation among hominins. C. In response, their anatomy, brain structures, and behaviors co-evolved, making them highly effective communicators. Evolutionary theories sometimes include narratives that depict a highly intelligent hominin, akin to a proto-human Einstein, who first discovers language once their brain and anatomy are sufficiently developed. Why hadn't anyone thought of it before? One could simply point at an elephant and imitate an elephant's trumpet call, thus creating a word for an elephant. Such explanations are highly anthropomorphic and oversimplify the complex evolutionary processes involved in language development. As we progress in this lecture, we will provide a critical deconstruction of these perspectives. More recent evolutionary models attempt to address limitations in earlier theories by incorporating new paleoanthropological and environmental evidence. These include 1. Variability Selection Hypothesis, Potts, 1998. This theory accounts for evidence suggesting that climate oscillated between hot and cool periods during human evolution. It argues that hominins developed adaptive flexibility, enabling their brains to invent language and culture as mechanisms for survival in such changing conditions. 2. Niche Construction Theory, Odling Smee, Lallan Feldman, 2003. This approach suggests that hominins actively modified their environment rather than simply adapting to it. In doing so, they created ecological niches that favored the emergence of complex cognitive abilities, including language. This theory posits that culture itself became a new ecological niche, which proto-humans discovered. As they began to adapt to this niche, it in turn shaped their development, reinforcing linguistic behavior and cognitive advancements. The fundamental principles underlying all evolutionary theories remain consistent. 1. Over millions of years, environmental factors gradually influenced human anatomy, contributed to the increase in brain mass and neural complexity, and shaped new behavioral models. 2. These cumulative changes led to emergent properties in the brain design, ultimately allowing for the development of symbolic thinking and language. Now let us examine the right-hand box of our theoretical framework. The disruptionist stance asserts that the capacity for language and symbolic thought is far too idiosyncratic to have gradually emerged through incremental evolutionary steps. Instead, proponents of this view argue that human cognition and language faculty arose suddenly, as a result of a disruptive, non-linear event in evolution. This mysterious event X is hypothesized to have triggered specific genetic mutations in proto-humans, leading to neural rewiring and the emergence of language. However, disruptionists typically do not specify what exactly event X was. While space radiation is occasionally suggested, no definitive explanation has been established. Holding this position presents a significant challenge for scientists. Prolonged adherence to this view may lead one to either A. accept the possibility of a supernatural origin of language, or B. admit uncertainty, which is not a particularly strong scientific stance. Indeed, if one cannot identify the cause of an event, it becomes difficult to credibly explain its consequences. As we expand our theoretical diagram, it becomes evident that disruptionism either leads to a belief in a metaphysical explanation for language, or gradually converges with the evolutionary perspective. For instance, many scientists who originally supported innate syntactic universals eventually embrace the possibility of their evolutionary origins. Meanwhile, their students and followers often adopt an evolutionary stance from the outset. For those unfamiliar with the concept of syntactic universals, we strongly recommend watching our video titled Chomskyan Linguistics, available on our channel. Disruptionists have found reputable scientific explanations that provide an alternative to supernatural explanations. Two such theories include: 1. Punctuated equilibrium and saltation. This theory, grounded in paleontology, suggests that species do not evolve through gradual, continuous variation. Instead, their development is characterized by long periods of stasis, punctuated by sudden, rapid change, a process known as saltation. Mutations that enable quick adaptation to dramatic environmental shifts may have played a role in human cognitive evolution. 2. The Baldwin effect. This evolutionary principle explores the role of learned behaviors in shaping genetic adaptations. If certain learned behaviors prove adaptive, they may be reinforced over generations through natural selection, ultimately becoming innate and instinctive. This mechanism can lead to epigenetic changes and even morphological adaptations within a relatively short time span, possibly within a few generations. Other scientific face-savers for the disruptionist stance suggest that event X itself may not be the key issue. Instead, they argue that the focus of research should shift toward understanding what event X enabled the human brain to do. Upon examining the lowest level of our diagram, we see that A. Regardless of initial disagreements, serious scientists ultimately agree that some form of evolutionary process was responsible for the emergence of language. B. However, significant divergences remain regarding how symbolic thinking relates to the human capacity for speech. There are 4 primary theoretical positions on this issue. 1. Speech preceded symbolic thought. Proto-humans first developed spoken language, which subsequently led to abstract and symbolic thinking. 2. Symbolic thought preceded speech. Proto-humans first developed symbols, which then gave rise to abstract thought. Language emerged later as an external expression of symbolic cognition. 3. Symbolic thinking is a separate faculty. Symbolic thought operates as an independent cognitive skill that is not directly tied to language. Language merely externalizes the computational processes occurring within the brain. Symbolic thinking is more closely associated with imagination, mirror neurons, empathy, and theory of mind. 4. Symbolic thinking and language as a unified process. These faculties represent two sides of the same biological adaptation unique to humans. However, from an evolutionary perspective, symbolic thinking and language are no different from other species-specific communication systems, for example, the honey dance in bees or echolocation in bats. Before deconstructing these positions, we must first address a fundamental question. What is a symbol, and what does it mean to think symbolically? Consider the famous painting by René Magritte, a key figure in surrealist art. The image depicts a pipe, yet the caption reads, "This is not a pipe." Magritte is correct. What we see is not a real pipe, it is merely a painted representation of one. In reality, the painting consists of canvas and pigments arranged in a wooden frame. Does this object function as a symbol of a pipe? Yes, but only to an extent. Once a symbol materializes, it becomes both an object and a symbol, a process known as objectification. What happens is the following. The artist first perceives a real object, a pipe, then forms a mental image of it, a pure symbol. This mental image is externalized through a painting, which becomes an objectified symbol. Once objectified, the symbol affects how future viewers will perceive the real object. This cycle of symbolic exchange repeats itself, creating an increasingly complex system of representations. Our study builds upon well-established theories in semiotics, the discipline concerned with signs and their meanings. Two primary semioticians are particularly relevant to our discussion. Charles Sanders Peirce developed the semiotic triangle, distinguishing between a. Object. The actual referent that the sign represents. b. Representamen, the perceptible form of a sign, for example, a painting of a pipe. c. Interpretant, the mental concept the sign evokes in an observer. Peirce defines the interpretant as the idea to which a sign gives rise in an actual or potential mind, or as a mediating representation. His model of a sign aligns with the contemporary semiotic model, in which the real object is referred to as the referent, the representamen as the sign vehicle, and the interpretant as sense. In the upper corner of this semiotic triangle, we thus find sense, or meaning. Notice how the structure of a sign in Peirce's theory differs from the one previously presented. Peirce's scheme, as well as the classical sign model in semiotics, describes a later stage in our perception of an object, one in which a symbolic representation of the object already exists. At this stage, our perception of a real object includes an awareness of its objectified symbolic representation, also known as the representamen or sign vehicle. This symbolic representation constitutes a complex amalgamation of past instances in which the object has been objectified. Each instance of objectification is original, even when the same object is represented by the same symbol, such as when a particular word is repeatedly used to name the same object. Consequently, every new use of the symbol adds to the complexity of our perception of the object. Meaning, or sense, as the terms are used interchangeably in this context, emerges not only from the direct perception of the real object but also from the mental associations embedded in its symbolic representation. These associations encompass the accumulated symbolic references and interpretations that the object has acquired over time. However, this raises a fundamental question: what exactly is meaning? It can be understood as a dispositional representation within our nervous system, serving as a guiding principle for the re-objectification of our perception of the real object. Through successive cycles of such meaning construction, the complexity of the objectified symbol progressively increases, while its resemblance to the original object simultaneously diminishes. Peirce himself classified signs into distinct levels of complexity. According to his framework, there are three categories of signs. Indices, direct physical references, for example, pointing gestures. Icons, resemblances between signs and objects. Symbols, arbitrary signs with no inherent connection to their reference, for example, spoken words. However, it was Jean Baudrillard, a French sociologist, philosopher, and cultural theorist, who truly emphasized the intrinsic tendency of signs to distort meaning and gradually lose their connection to reality in the process of continuous recycling. To illustrate this phenomenon, consider the following stages. 1. A real object. For example, a tree in the physical world. 2. A realistic representation of this object. For example, a realist painting of the tree. 3. A distorted representation of this object. An impressionist painting that alters its features. 4. A representation of a non-existent reality. A painting that depicts a painting of the tree. 5. A representation entirely disconnected from reality, for example, an abstract painting of the tree, what Baudrillard terms a simulacrum. We see that, as signs evolve, they gradually lose their connection to reality. Baudrillard's theory suggests that signs are inherently unstable. Over time, they shift from representing reality to representing other signs, leading to an endless cycle of self-referential meaning. This process compromises the sign's function as a proxy for reality, ultimately rendering it disconnected from its original referent. This raises an intriguing paradox. Why would proto-humans adopt symbolic thinking, an inherently unreliable mechanism to reflect reality, to communicate with one another? The direction of our inquiry depends on the theoretical position we adopt within our framework. Let us examine the 4 primary perspectives. This school of thought proposes that symbolic thinking and language are 2 aspects of the same biological behavior. Proponents of this view, such as Ruth Millikan in her biosemantics theory, argue that a. Language and symbolic culture emerged as an adaptive behavior. b. Humans imitated and refined successful communicative behaviors, leading to cultural evolution. c. Perception systems and behavioral decision-making mechanisms evolved together, reinforcing linguistic capabilities. Some other philosophers, such as Fred Dretske, similarly argue that a. Reasoning and language are merely extensions of existing biological perception systems. b. Linguistic categorization allows for better filtering of sensory data, optimizing decision-making processes. While these theories are logically sound, they face one major challenge. Why did language and symbolic thinking emerge so late and so suddenly in human evolution? Archaeological evidence suggests that language emerged only around 50,000 to 100,000 years ago. No traces of symbolic behavior have been found in Homo sapiens or other Homo species before this period. Linguist Derek Bickerton underscores this issue. More than 1 million years ago, there were already plenty of hominins whose brain sizes, more than 1,000 cubic centimeters, fell within the normal range of modern humans. If increased brain size spells increased intelligence, and if people with brains smaller than some members of Homo erectus can talk, do science, and invent, why is it that the species preceding ours endured the same harsh conditions for so long without making any serious attempt to improve their lot? Everything in human civilization, herding, agriculture, cities, industrialization, and the exploration of the solar system, was squeezed into a bare 2/100th part, or 0.0005% of that period. This evidence strongly suggests that symbolic and linguistic behavior appeared suddenly, after which cultural evolution developed around it. This challenges the theory that human cognitive abilities and perceptual systems developed as an integrated process. Perceptual mechanisms evolve gradually, adapting in response to behavioral changes. If perception evolved in tandem with symbolic behavior as an interconnected process, the first indications of language and culture would have emerged much earlier. The next 2 positions in our framework also contend that language evolved gradually over time, but they adopt more traditional evolutionary arguments. Classical evolutionists argue that environmental challenges shaped proto-humans into creatures with language and symbolic thinking. It is often assumed that language and culture were so beneficial to our ancestors that their development was a natural and inevitable process. However, with a deeper understanding of symbolic thinking and signs, we have reason to question this assumption. Upon closer examination, symbolic thinking offers no immediate advantage or appeal to an animal, nor does it appear to be a natural tendency. Stripped of complex explanations and analyses, symbolic thinking is, at its core, an unusual behavior in which an individual arbitrarily assigns one object to represent another. We take a sign as a referent, attribute the functionality of one object to another, and even begin using objects as if they were something else entirely. What could be more unnatural? What could be more dangerous? What could be more disastrous as a survival strategy? Many animals possess, in rudimentary form, nearly all the components necessary for the development of symbolic thinking and symbolic communication. Yet, they consistently refrain from following this path in any meaningful way. Moreover, they demonstrate little receptiveness to the supposed advantages of symbolic thinking, even when these are explicitly introduced to them. It is as if animals instinctively recognized that this cognitive direction is unsuitable and should be avoided. While we can identify numerous environmental challenges that may have shaped human evolution, the ability to perceive one thing as another, contrary to direct sensory input, appears to be one of the least practical skills for overcoming such challenges. But this raises an essential question. What exactly made language and symbolic thinking such evolutionary advantages? Proto-humans faced no fundamentally unique challenges compared to other species. They had survived without symbolic thinking for millions of years. Why did it suddenly become essential? Furthermore, Neanderthals, who coexisted with Homo sapiens, thrived without symbolic thought and language. This makes it difficult to explain why language and culture emerged only in one species, and so abruptly. We remember that symbolic thinking is not inherently beneficial for survival. It involves taking one object for another, an extremely unnatural and risky behavior. Why did humans take this cognitive leap when other species avoided it? Let us examine in this logic the argument that symbolic thought developed prior to language. A substantial number of scientists support this stance. For example, linguist Daniel Everett proposes that a. Early hominins recognized visual similarities between objects, for example, a rock resembling an animal. b. They began using objects as symbolic representations. c. This associative behavior led to the emergence of abstract thought and, eventually, language. This theory is problematic. No animal today exhibits such behavior. If an animal mistakenly perceives one object as another, it quickly discards the false lead once it realizes it is false. Experiments show that animals do not maintain interest in deceptive objects once they recognize them as such. Imaginative analogies between objects provide no survival benefit and are, in fact, a risky behavior for any species. Thus, it is unlikely that proto-humans voluntarily adopted symbolic thinking before language developed. Another position asserts that language preceded symbolic thought. In the beginning was the word. Derek Bickerton argued that a. The first spoken word triggered abstract categorization in the mind of proto-humans. b. Words allowed individuals to mentally manipulate categories, leading to symbolic thought. However, this theory also fails under scrutiny. Bickerton himself admitted that one word alone is useless without a structured system of symbols. Language only functions when multiple words exist in an agreed structure. Another argument is that pidgin languages, basic communication systems, develop into full Creole languages within just 2 to 3 generations, indicating that language does not evolve incrementally but appears suddenly in full form. One word cannot be in the beginning. It is unlikely that a single ingenious individual set the snowball rolling by uttering the first word. Bickerton himself concludes the first case of language use must have been fully functional. This also aligns with findings from French anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, who argued that language and symbolic thought emerged in a fully structured form rather than through a gradual process. What remains for us to consider? The idea presented in this box suggests that we should not conflate symbolic thinking with language, nor assume an interdependent relationship between them. According to this perspective, language serves as the externalization of internal cognitive universals. In other words, and to put it more simply, language is the external expression of neuronal algorithms that govern perception and related biological systems. But what about imagination? What about the arts? What about the creative use of language, which some scholars argue is the very foundation of linguistic capacity? Universalists dismiss these concerns. They distinguish between actual spoken language, or language performance, and the operation of universal cognitive algorithms, referred to as language competence. The actual use of language, they argue, can be influenced, or even contaminated, by various factors, including imagination and theory of mind. Cognitive psychologist Michael Tomasello, a leading researcher on theory of mind in animals, arrives at a different conclusion. There is the possibility that children's development of a fully representational theory of mind, including false beliefs, is dependent on several years of linguistic communication. There is much evidence for the role of language in the development of false belief understanding. This suggests that imagination and our ability to connect with the minds of others do not merely interfere with the expression of cognitive universals in language. Rather, these distinctly human traits may themselves be generated by our linguistic capacity. The claim, made by linguists such as Steven Pinker, that the faculty for language exists independently of symbolic thinking, appears to be an effort to align empirical reality with the theoretical model of inherited cognitive universals. However, the very notion of universals remains a subject of debate. A linguistic unit is by definition a sign, and its use necessarily entails symbolic thinking. To employ a sign, one must first acquire the capacity for symbolic representation. Without this ability, externalizing thought, regardless of how free from external influences it may be, would be impossible. Thus, we must ultimately reject this position. We have now completed our review of the mainstream scientific perspectives on the origin of language. We found the four primary theories unconvincing and the explanations offered in their defense unsatisfactory. However, since we maintain that symbolic thinking must have emerged first in evolution, with language developing subsequently, our position aligns most closely with the perspective presented in this section. That said, contemporary science has yet to provide a compelling explanation for how animal behavior could have given rise to symbolic thinking, particularly given the many idiosyncrasies of such behavior. Let us summarize the findings we made today. We reached the following key conclusions. 1. Symbolic thinking is a prerequisite for language faculty. 2. Symbolic thought is an idiosyncratic and unnatural behavior for animals. 3. Both symbolic thinking and language likely emerged relatively recently and developed at a rapid pace. 4. The adoption of symbolic thinking by early humans within the conventional evolutionary framework of adaptation to external challenges appears implausible. It would have been disadvantageous for an individual to begin acting symbolically in isolation, and no environmental challenge could have led to the rapid, simultaneous adoption of a single complex symbolic code by an entire population. Such a system would have required full functionality from its inception or would have had to become fully operational within a very short time frame. Let us revisit the title of today's lecture. Who needs symbolic thinking? And yet, our ancestors acquired it. In the next lecture, we will examine Event X, which enabled this development to take place. Meanwhile, thank you for watching, and we look forward to our next session.